Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Council Island. We have been doing a lot of these lately because we have an exciting public hearing going on right now. I don't know if you've heard about that, but today we are doing something a little bit different. We are going back in time to hear about the origin of all of these extended public hearings. Although I think there are some things we could go even further back to, and also the origins of the one and only Kathryn Davies, who joins me today. How are you doing, Kathryn?
I'm so good, Alex. How are you?
I am so well, not at all distraught, but we are going to get into this. So tell me a little bit about the Guidebook for Great Communities. Can you explain what this is in the first place?
Well, funny you should ask, Alex. I've been thinking a lot about it this past week. Maybe I've been thinking a lot about it for the last 5 years. But the Guidebook for Great Communities, it was a public hearing that was held in March of 2021, so about 5 years ago. And at the time, I was sort of interested in urban planning. I had volunteered on my community association a little bit, and I was maybe slightly involved or slightly engaged in Calgary municipal politics. But this wasn't really on my radar, and I hadn't been paying too much attention to what was going on at City Hall. But I used to be quite active on Twitter back when Twitter was a more normal place to be. And in March of that year, all of a sudden things started to kind of heat up on Twitter, and everyone was talking about this Guidebook for Great Communities public hearing. And I thought to myself, oh, what's going on here? This seems interesting. And I looked into it a little bit. And so there was a public hearing that started maybe, I don't know, March 21st or something. And it was about the Guidebook for Great Communities. It was a technical document developed by the City of Calgary Planning Department. And the idea was that they would put together these structures or these plans, and it would help guide local area plans. And so if you're not familiar with local area plans, they're small regional planning documents, these planning exercises that the city does. I could go on at length about them, but I won't right now. But it was a very innocuous document. If you can read through it, and there are some nice little maps and diagrams of different housing types. But there was one thing in there that got a little bit controversial, and that was a neighborhood form typology that they had designed that combined different types of housing into one district. And so it suggested that you could have single detached homes and duplexes and low density row housing all in the same neighborhood. And so
Which is absolutely ridiculous, by the way. That is absolutely absurd. Imagine townhouses existing near a duplex or near a single detached home.
Well, I think to you and I, that seems fine. I'm here from my bungalow, my 1950s bungalow in the basement, and just across the street from me, around the corner from me, are a number of row houses, and we're doing okay here. But some people were very, very upset about this proposal, and so in advance of the guidebook, in advance of the public hearing on the guidebook, there was a bit of a campaign, a very expensive campaign. There were text messages sent, there were mailers sent, and a group of people who remain mostly anonymous purchased ad space in Avenue Magazine, advertorial space, and they also purchased ad space on the cover of the Calgary Herald. So that's maybe more money than I have available to spend on any kind of advocacy. And so they took this very seriously, were very committed to ensuring that the Guidebook for Great Communities did not go forward.
Yeah, and of course we continue to see a little bit of that with this hearing. We know that there was an ad taken out on the front page of the Calgary Herald talking about needing to repeal rezoning, which I thought, listen, I think looking at this hearing, we all kind of figured that the repeal is probably going to happen. I have zero level of confidence that it won't happen. Most of the people on council ran with some level of repeal in their campaign, and so for people to feel still able to purchase an ad on the front page of the Calgary Herald, even though they're going to win anyways, that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah. And so as the conversation got going, like I wasn't involved. I was away at school at the time, I think. And so what was like the tone of the conversation? How did people end up showing up, and how what were some of the positive remarks towards the guidebook for great communities as well? Like, was there any level of support for it?
Yeah. So I'll answer that question, but I'm going to back up a little bit. So before the guidebook, and this is before I was engaged in municipal politics in any way, but there were a couple of other really controversial topics at City Hall. So one was secondary suites, which, a decade ago, that was a real thing. Like, people were very wary of secondary suites, and the introduction of citywide secondary suites was going to be the apocalypse. It was going to be the parking, Alex. The parking was going to be out of control. So it took years of concerted effort and advocacy to get secondary suites across the line. I wasn't involved at that point, so I can't really speak too much in detail about it. But the other, one of the other things that was really controversial was the Southwest BRT. So, Alex, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Southwest BRT.
I, in fact, used to be a daily user of it, and running for council last year, I heard a lot of people still very upset about it. And of course, I'll highlight as well that there are a lot of people who are really happy with it and love it and think it's the bee's knees. But yes, I am familiar.
Yeah, so it was very controversial when it was implemented. You can Google it. You can look up the history of it. I don't need to go into too much detail, but I know that at one point they had to start canceling engagement sessions because they were getting so spicy. There were some threats of violence. There were people yelling things like, we don't need the bus because we drive our Mercedes-Benzes to and from our homes. And so, there's a bit of a divide. But I will never forget talking to someone who was involved in that. And he said something that has stuck with me to this day. He said, every person who spoke up in opposition was there speaking about their own personal needs, wants, and preferences. Every single person who spoke up in support was talking about the broader benefits to the city, was talking about benefits maybe to themselves, but also benefits to the community, benefits to people who are less fortunate, benefits to, a very different societal orientation. So I think about that. Honestly, I think about that all the time, and I come back to that a lot whenever I'm trying to make our city a better place and trying to work towards some of these goals that a lot of us are engaged in.
Yeah, and I think that distinction of like what people are thinking about when they speak against something versus when they speak in favor of something, it's about who is this affecting and who is this for, right? That's great if you drive your Mercedes-Benz to everywhere that you need to go. This bus is not for you. It's for somebody else. I know that there are people who live in that area who benefit from the Max Yellow and from the Southwest BRT as an efficient form of transportation for themselves to wherever they happen to need to go. And for some of them, it's a choice. For myself, it was a choice. And for some people, it's a health thing. Some people cannot drive because of health and other circumstances. And so, looking outside of ourselves, and this is something that we've seen again in this public hearing, is a lot of people, they just don't like the look of townhouses, which that is a valid opinion. You are allowed to have that opinion, but that is not taking into context the broader needs of the city and the people who live here. So keep going a little bit on the on the Guidebook for Great Communities and how it shook out. Sure.
So when we got to the Guidebook for Great Communities, the first day it was pretty unanimous in opposition. There were a few speakers speaking up in support of it, but for the most part, people were there. The message was very consistent. It said, this needs more engagement, send it back to administration, and remove this part of the guidebook that suggests that row houses and duplexes and single detached homes can live in harmony together, because they cannot. So it was resounding, and it was just relentless. Speaker after speaker got up and gave that same message. People were in tears. People were very emotional, and they were very coordinated. And so I think, there's been a theme in Calgary municipal advocacy for, as long as I've lived in Calgary, that we need to curb sprawl. I mean, going back to the 70s, going back even further than that, there's always been this awareness that Calgary, we don't have natural barriers to our expansion, but there are really good policy reasons to curb sprawl, to stop spreading out the way we do. And so I think that a lot of people who have been engaged on that, they started noticing that this hearing was happening and that there was this opposition to this tool designed to help just make our city a little bit more efficient and functional. And so, like I said, I was active on Twitter at the time, and I started noticing a lot of chatter about it. And so I ended up tuning into the hearing. At this point, I'd never been to City Hall. I'd never watched a public hearing. I had no idea how any of this worked, but I managed to find the feed or the stream of it, and started following along. And I mean, frankly, I was shocked by the tone. I was shocked by the consistency of the message. And I just thought it felt wrong. It felt really wrong to me. And so there were a few of us, there was some messaging on Twitter, some text messages sent. And I remember getting a text message from a friend who was like, "What's going on with this guidebook?" And I was like, well, I was trying to figure that out myself. And we ended up agreeing that both of us should call in and speak at this hearing. So it was early COVID. And so it was all done virtually. There was no option to go in person. So we called into this hearing and we said our bit. And then he texted me afterward and was like, thanks for helping me to do that. It felt really good to get involved and to say something. And now I want to speak at council all the time. And I won't say this person's name, but now this person does speak at council all the time. And so do I. So this was kind of the first instance of that.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned how initially it was all people speaking in opposition. And then you slowly started to get more people saying like, wait a second, but I agree with this. And it's always harder to get people to show up in favor of something, in support of something, because a lot of people just say like, yeah, it's fine. And, like it's not important to them that they show up and speak in favor because they think, sure, yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think what we've seen since the guidebook hearing is that we've built up more and more people who realize like, oh, I actually have to go and say something about what I like. And I have to show up preemptively and not wait and start on the back foot. And I think jumping forward a little bit in this story before we maybe go back a little bit, but when there was the housing task force, when there was the Home is Here strategy, and council said, no, we're not going to do it. And then people showed up and said, look at it again. And then they looked at it again, and a bunch of people showed up in favor. And they said, okay. And then they booted the RCG down a little bit farther down the road. And then the RCG came up, and we had this huge public hearing. And it was mostly against, as far as the people who spoke. And then now, though, at this public hearing, we've evened it out a little bit more, right? And so I think as we go forward, we're going to see more and more people saying like, oh, shoot, I have to fight for the things that I care about and that I want in my city. Mm-hmm. Do you have hope for the future? Do you think, like, is that tracking?
Yeah. So just to go back to something you said, yeah, it's really difficult to get people out to speak in support of things. It's really a lot easier to get people to come out and speak in opposition to things. In some way, the people who started showing up toward the end of the guidebook hearing, I mean, I may have glanced at the guidebook. Like, I was not interested in the technical document, but I was really keen to balance out some of the rhetoric that was happening in this hearing. So I think a lot of us were there to support what was a good document, but also because we were kind of ticked off by the tenor, by the tone of the meeting thus far. And I think, More Neighbors, we've been around for 2.5 years and we are advocating for things, but we are also there to just be a bit of a balance to what I sometimes refer as the neighborhood defenders, people who are very, very keen on maintaining the status quo, preserving the quote character of their neighborhood at all costs to the city. So in some ways we're speaking up in favor of things, but it's also speaking in contrast to something else.
Yeah, and I think that contrast is really important because it does get missed whenever something comes before council. They're only hearing from a certain subset of people, right? And if it's a small thing, they might hear from 2 people who really don't like that there's going to be a daycare on their block. An example that I turn to is when I was door knocking. I heard somebody say, if you speak to anybody on this block, they're going to tell you that they hate this project that's going up and that they're against it, and that's where we stand. A significant number of doors opened on that block, and I had a lot of conversations, and that person at the beginning of the block was the only person who mentioned that project and having an issue with it. And so I think often we don't hear from everybody. We hear from a very select group of people who are particularly passionate about this one thing. And the truth of the matter is most people don't care. Most people don't like, they literally could not care less because they've got better things to do. And you mentioned that before this, you had never spoken at council. You had never come up. My first time speaking at council was the first RCG public hearing. That was my first time speaking at council, and I've spoken several times since and gotten more and more involved since, largely thanks to yourself. And like we all kind of have that origin story that gets us involved in advocacy, but I think it's really important that whatever that is, that we continue to show up and continue to try and make a difference. And like you said, I like that you said not speaking against these other people, but speaking in contrast to them, to demonstrate that there are other opinions in this city and there are people who are thinking differently about things.
So shortly after the Guidebook hearing, I came across a book called Neighborhood Defenders, and it's written by an American political scientist called Kathryn Levine-Einstein. And it's just a terrific book. It's a really good read. She's done quite a bit of media. You can find interviews with her where she talks about what she found in her book, and it's just a really interesting study. So she's from the Boston area, and she found this really rich data set. So I think it was maybe the suburbs of Boston, and I should have maybe checked that before this podcast, but she found this data set, and it could tie individual speakers to their home address, so their home's assessed value, their voter registration, their, all this really rich demographic data, like essentially census data. And so they went through a massive amount of this data, and they came out with these conclusions that may surprise you. So the people who tend to participate in public consultation on housing tend to be older, wealthier, whiter, and more Republican leaning. And so obviously there's variation in that, but I think it was apparent to me watching the Guidebook hearing, and then following city council subsequent to that, and watching people who showed up to speak in opposition to housing at public hearings, that it did tend to be very unrepresentative of Calgary. We are a diverse city. We have we have a lot of racial diversity. We have a lot of socioeconomic diversity, and we just were not seeing that represented at council. And a lot of voices were missing from consultation on housing. So after I read this book, I made the difficult decision to go back and rewatch the entire Guidebook for Great Communities public hearing.
Nice. Yeah, great.
Yes.
Very healthy, I'm sure.
I had to take lots of breaks. I had to, go for lots of walks in between panels, but I watched the entire thing. I had some help. I won't name names, but you know who you are, who helped me gather that data. But I have a data set. I have a spreadsheet. The data is not nearly as granular as the data in Massachusetts. I could maybe have made some guesses about people's age category or whatever. But the one thing that was fairly consistent is that people tended to name their neighborhoods. And so I was able to tie, actually, I've got it here. So there were 138 speakers, which seems so quaint because we're probably going to surpass 500 this week's hearing.
Yeah, just a normal public hearing in Calgary.
Just a normal public hearing. So 81 spoke in opposition, 53 spoke in support, and 4 were neutral or undecided. But of the opposition speakers, so 68 out of 81 listed the neighborhoods. And so I was able to have a good look at where people were coming from that were speaking. And I don't need to go into too much detail, but they tended to be clustered in a few fairly affluent neighborhoods. One thing that I thought was so interesting is that there was not a single neighborhood mentioned east of Deerfoot. So it was, there are a lot of people living east of Deerfoot. There are a lot of people living in parts of Calgary that were just completely absent from this discussion. Yeah. And so I thought that was really telling. It was clustered. If you were paying attention to council on Monday, my friend Peter Dormar has taken this data set and he's done quite a bit of interesting work on it. And so he looked at, we can't look up people's home assessment value, but if you live in a particular neighborhood, the city has information on the average or the median income in that neighborhood. I think that was the measure that he used. And so he was able to make these very tidy charts that showed that people of a fairly high income bracket were dramatically overrepresented in these hearings. And I know that one speaker last week questioned whether affluence should necessarily lead to influence. And I think that's a really, really important question in these hearings.
Yeah. And you'll notice that there weren't any homeless people who came and spoke at the public hearing, right?
I did notice that.
And that is who this most affects, right? Mm-hmm. Are we going to build housing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's an important data point to think about who is showing up. My brother brought that up in his presentation on Monday morning. He mentioned that his friends can't show up because they're at work. They have jobs, or they're at school. It's hard to show up. And when you have other things on your mind, like starting your life out, building relationships, moving out of your family's home, doing school, finding a good job, all of these things, you're not necessarily thinking about, I really wonder about whether or not we should preserve the single detached community character of this neighborhood. You're not thinking about that. You've got other things on your mind. The people who have time, energy, and resources to think about that stuff are people who have this as one of their major hobbies, like us, and rich people who I guess have nothing better to do than just try and exercise control on the world around them, right? In whatever way that they can. And if that means wasting your money on an ad in the Calgary Herald, that's crazy to me. That's crazy to think like, oh yeah, I just have money to do that. I just don't like this thing that the city's doing, this very small thing that the city's doing. And it's about control. It's not about neighborhood character. It's about control. That's my take, at least. I think you're absolutely right. It is. That's a big element of it. Now, I do want to be careful. I mean, public engagement, I think, is really, really important. And people who are affluent also deserve to participate in public engagement.
Absolutely.
I also think there are really valid issues that are brought up around things like neighborhood aesthetics. I mean, we have some really beautiful neighborhoods in Calgary, and I think that beauty is worth preserving.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking about, so I grew up in Lethbridge, and I grew up in a heritage home that my parents purchased in 1975. And they're not wealthy, but they've certainly invested a lot in their home, in restoring it over the years. And I was thinking about the fact that when I was a teenager, There was a small nursing home across the street, and they decided to redevelop this into a much larger nursing home. And so the neighborhood, there is a neighborhood association there, and they took a look at the plans. And according to my father, the plans looked like a communist prison or something. And so the neighborhood was very unhappy about it. But what I think is interesting about that is that the neighborhood at no point was trying to stop the nursing home. They weren't saying, this can't be here. They just said, look, we've got this neighborhood aesthetic. A lot of us are very invested in our homes. Can we do a little bit better with the design? And they ended up getting, it's an award-winning design for a nursing home. And it looks like some character homes, and then it expands into this massive nursing home facility. So I think it's fine for people to want to be involved in the way their neighborhood evolves. And I totally support that. There have even been some projects in my neighborhood where, when I was part of the community association, where we were like, I think you could do a little bit better. And then we worked with, the project lead to make it just a little bit better for the neighborhood. I don't have a problem with that. But I think when you hear over and over again, we need to preserve the single detached character of our neighborhood. We want to preserve the single detached character lifestyle that we have chosen. And when the emphasis is not just on, I want to maintain my own property, but I also want to be able to control all the properties around me, I think that starts to get really problematic. And I will say that I got really interested in restrictive covenants a few years ago. Alex, I don't know if you've ever heard of restrictive covenants.
I haven't heard anything about this. No.
And so there was litigation on it in my neighborhood, and I started looking into it. And it turns out that the history of restrictive covenants is tied to racial exclusion. And when racial exclusion became not really allowed, it sort of evolved into socioeconomic exclusion. And so I've been aware of this really long history of people wanting to exclude the wrong types of people from their neighborhood. And so that's part of the lens through which I view these public hearings. And so we want to we want to maintain the character of our neighborhood. But what does that really mean? And there's a great article by Globe and Mail architecture critic Alex Bezikovic, where he talks about exactly what neighborhood character means. And he just comes right out and says it. It's about the people that are allowed to live in your neighborhood as much as it is about the built form or housing type. And so that has to be discussed when we are in the middle of this public hearing this week. Some people would not like to hear that, but it's just a reality of the conversation. We can't ignore it.
Yeah. And that's kind of, that's the quiet part that they don't say. Some people do say it. There was a lady during this public hearing who said that predators live in garage suites. Mm-hmm. And that is not the first time we've heard this sort of thing. I think we heard a little bit more of the conspiratorial end of things in the last big public hearing, the first RCG hearing. And it is frustrating because it's like, wait. I'm not saying predators are welcome in neighborhoods, but it is like a description of a person that you might associate with this house. If you don't like single people living in your neighborhood, for whatever reason, whatever you think about single people, if you don't like immigrants living in your neighborhood and you associate townhouses with immigrants, that might be an angle that you kind of derive this need for control from. And I think it's really important that we do talk about it, and that we want to call it out, but also that we encourage other people to speak up and say, no, I welcome more neighbors in my neighborhood. I welcome new people in my neighborhood, and I also welcome housing diversity that allows the people who have called this neighborhood home for a long time to continue to call it home, even when their lifestyle and needs change. Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with that. So I will say, I was a community association volunteer for a long time, so I have had a lot of conversations with people about neighborhood change. There is something really instinctual about that resistance. And so maybe it's some kind of evolutionary mechanism. I don't really know. But, I've got lovely, wonderful, caring neighbors. And they hear about a townhouse going up and they're like, oh, I'm really nervous about this. people have that reaction. And it's not that they're bad people. It's just that that is the reaction that pops up. And so I find that it's really easy to talk through it. And there's, you can explain that there's like, there aren't going to be predators in the garage suite. Like, it's just, the probability of that is very low. It's probably going to be, maybe a medical student or, something great. And so I'm careful to I don't want to vilify people who are scared or who are uncomfortable with neighborhood change. I think it's totally fine to have those feelings, but I think we just need a bit of self-reflection when we start going to great lengths to make sure that there is no change in our neighborhoods, because it's just completely unsustainable in this city right now to expect that. Things change.
And I also appreciate that, change can be scary. My neighbor's house just sold. And so, there is this unknown. Who are my new neighbors going to be? Or will there be a new development next door? I don't know. And the unknown is kind of what's scary about it. But it's somebody that we can meet and somebody that we can introduce ourselves to, and more friends, more neighbors, right? That's the whole point. And hopefully not more bad neighbors.
Only good neighbors.
Only good neighbors. And I think most people are good neighbors. That's the thing too, right? We live in a city full of wonderful people, and wonderful people want to live here. And so that excites me. But let's get back to kind of this public hearing, this origin, and how this fight has carried on since the guidebook.
Yeah. So like I said, I was really affected by it. It really bothered me, and I was really happy to be able to participate in the hearing toward the end. And then after that, there were a few people who we just sort of connected through Twitter. There were a couple of people that I had known through my community association volunteering, and we just said, maybe there needs to be something a bit organized here. And so we started, we had some Zoom calls, and we said, we should do something. Someone should do something about this. And that sort of evolved to a group chat. And occasionally we would talk about, maybe we could do this or maybe we could do that. And nothing really formalized until, I believe it was June 23rd of 2023. It was earlier than that. It was June 6th or 7th of 2023. And you alluded to this earlier in this podcast, but the City of Calgary's Housing Affordability Task Force report came to council. And it was a great document. This task force had put in so much work over the past year to prepare this. They had all these wonderful suggestions. They'd done a ton of work. There was a lot of data. Everything in it was great, except this one recommendation. And that one recommendation was that they create a way in the city for single detached homes, duplexes or semi-detached homes, and row houses to all live together in harmony in the same neighborhoods. And so I think City Council had been through this before. They had seen how that goes down, and they said, there's no way. We are not touching that. We know what will happen. There will be a backlash. And so they rejected the document completely. They just sent it back.
Which is wild. That's wild to make a task force to solve the housing crisis and see one thing that you're kind of nervous about and just say, you know what, actually, about the housing crisis, we're going to do nothing. We're just going to do nothing instead. Insane.
Right. So I think by 2023, things were getting expensive. Like the housing costs were going up, rent was going up. People were really starting to feel the squeeze. And I think everyone knew someone who was struggling. Even 2 years before that, when the guidebook hearing happened, I don't think it was the same situation. There wasn't that same urgency. But this time was quite different. And so I know that the backlash was swift. Thinking back to the good old days of Twitter, the backlash on Twitter was swift. The councillors' email inboxes were full, the phone lines lit up, and they realized that they had actually struck a nerve and that there was appetite for them to do something about our housing situation. And so if you'll recall, a couple of days later, or I think it was the next day, the meeting was still going, and they realized that they had made a political miscalculation. They recalled that vote and voted again, and this time they voted to support the Housing Affordability Task Force report. And that ended up leading to the infamous 2024 public hearing on rezoning for housing, also known as blanket rezoning. But the day after that Housing Affordability Task Force debacle, Willem Klumpenhauer, he dropped in the group chat one day, "We need a More Neighbours Calgary." Because Willem and I had both been in contact with a really wonderful group called More Neighbours Toronto. And I said, yes, we do. And that needs to happen today. And so within 24 hours, we had set up a server. We had put together the social media accounts. And we just, it was the moment that had to happen. And so that was the birth of More Neighbours Calgary. But I do think...
We love it.
And we love it. We love it, and we have a great time. But I don't think any of this would have happened if it hadn't been for the feelings that emerged following the Guidebook for Great Communities public hearing.
Yeah, and then we got into the big RCG hearing, and then we upzoned the city, and now we're going back.
That's right.
Is that what's happening?
That's what's happening. Wow.
What a ride, huh?
It's been a ride. It's definitely been a ride. One other thing that I'll point out. So Brent Toderin is an urban planner. He's a very large platform. He's very active on various social media platforms. So he dug out an old tweet of his. So I don't go on Twitter anymore, but he posted it on Blue Sky. And he calls it the Populist Playbook. And he says, I'll read this out. "Have you heard of the Populist Playbook? A few years ago, I posted what I still consider one of my most important messages. It was about the Populist Playbook that I've watched play out often over my 33 plus years of city planning. Do these steps sound familiar?" So step 1 says, deliberately scare people with misinformation and lies about what a proposed policy or plan will do. Step 2, wait for misinformed people to complain. Step 3, say that clearly people are concerned, so we should listen to the people and reject the plan. Step 4, mainstream media reports the controversy rather than the fact it was manufactured and amplifies the quotes of those who manufactured it. Step 5, other elected leaders who know the truth still vote against the good policy or plan because they're too afraid of the heat. And so there's a timestamp here. It was posted on March 23rd of 2021, which was, I believe, the day after the Guidebook for Great Communities hearing ended. So he had watched that hearing too, and we were aligned in our feelings about it. But I think this is really important to keep in mind in this current public hearing, because I think that exact same thing has happened here. I mean, rezoning for housing, like, let's let some row houses be built in our established neighborhoods. Like I said, my bungalow is surrounded by them and they're totally fine. But I think there has been this maybe a moral panic manufactured around it. And it's been extremely effective. And so if you look at the way the media reports it, there was a CTV headline, I think it was a CTV the other day, that was like, hundreds of Calgarians line up to oppose blanket rezoning. And I was like, well, I mean, there are actually also hundreds of Calgarians out to support it, but it's been an effective strategy. But I think it's important to just remember that a lot of this outrage is manufactured by people who have money, people who have enough money to buy the front page of the Calgary Herald and put out very glossy mailers. And I just don't know if it's a fair reflection of how Calgary as a whole feels about what is essentially a really good policy.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, most people don't care. And I think this council, if they do choose to undo this rezoning, which I reckon they will, the next council will just put it back. Like that's the thing, is most young people, and by young people I mean like 50 and younger, think it's fine. Think it's totally fine. And the polling shows that. And the younger you go, the more fine they feel about it. And so I think either this council keeps it or the next council adds it back in. And maybe because we've lost ground, we'll have to go even farther. That's the thing too, I think people don't understand, is that the reason that we have to do this now is because we didn't do it sooner. We didn't do a lighter plan sooner, so now we have to do this, I guess, more intense plan now. And I think that's critical to note. So we'll see. We'll see what this council does. And I would be curious to ask them if they feel like they're really doing the right thing or if they're doing the politically expedient thing. I don't know.
I don't know either. So I will say there are a number of councillors that were elected on a platform of repealing. And I think that some of them are very committed to that. Some of them think that that is actually the right thing to do. I think others of them know that it's not a good thing to do, but it's politically expedient for them. But I know that councillors are legally required to remain amenable to persuasion. And I know that there are some councillors who are there in good faith. They are listening. And I think there is a high probability that rezoning for housing is repealed. But I think that there is maybe a growing awareness of just how fraught that decision is going to be. And I think it's interesting for us because I don't know if you've heard of Edmonton, Alberta, Alex?
I've heard of it, yeah.
So Edmonton is going down a very different path. So several years ago, Edmonton upzoned their entire city to R2. Calgary should have done that at the same time, to your point just now about how the longer we delay, the bigger the change is going to have to be. And Edmonton, about a year before we did, they increased their base zoning to not quite to an RCG level, but to something fairly close. Edmonton is booming. So Edmonton is building a ton of housing. Rents are coming down. They're building it in places where people want to live. They're building it in places where people can choose to rely on modes of transportation other than the private automobile. And so, there's always been a bit of a rivalry between Calgary and Edmonton. You might even call it a heated rivalry. And I think it's going to be interesting over the next few years to see how these two cities diverge. And I think it's very likely that Edmonton will continue to grow, continue to be a more affordable, more livable city. And I think as Calgary regresses, we're going to see a gap open up in affordability and probably on some other metrics.
Yeah. Yeah, not something that I want to see, given that Calgary is the best city in the world. But that depending on what this council does, that I would be really sad if that changed. But yeah, any final thoughts as we wrap up this little episode here?
Just that it's been such a joy to be involved in this community of people who want to see good housing policy in Calgary. The people in the More Neighbours community are so dedicated, so smart, so engaged, and so caring. And it's a privilege to associate with everyone. And the hearing has been up and down, but there've been some really bright moments.
Yeah.
And so,
part of me, yeah, go ahead.
No, that was it.
That was it. Part of me really hopes that the city continues to regress because I meet all of my best friends through these public hearings. And so if I didn't have to go and speak at council all the time about all these problems that they're not fixing,
what
I'd be
would
friendless.
we even do?
Exactly. So I want to thank council for consistently making the wrong decisions. Yeah, because that's how I've made all my friends. So thank you, Kathryn, for joining us and sharing your origin story as well as the origin story of these extended public hearings. I hope we set a record this time. I don't think we will, but there's still a chance. And I hope that after this, that we find something else to go and speak to set a record for. I love public hearings.
Well, I've got great news for you, Alex. So if rezoning for housing is successfully repealed, Calgary City Council is going to go back to scrutinizing every single land use change in a monthly public hearing. So you'll have an opportunity to go speak to every single item there if you so choose. So it will be public hearings for days.
Yeah, you know what?
Public hearings all the time.
I'll bring a book and I'll speak to every single one. Kathryn, so much. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Remember who you are. Return with honor. And we will see
Alex.
you all. Thank you. Oh, and shout out to Marco Carducci. Thanks for listening.
Hi, Marco.
We'll see you guys.